All right, tonight we are in Amos 6, and we will cover the 6th chapter, verses 1 through 14. So let's start out and read verses 1 through 3 and look at what's being said here. Woe to those who are at ease in Zion, and to those who feel secure in the mountain of Samaria. The distinguished men of the foremost of nations, to whom the house of Israel comes. Go over to Calmah and look, and go from there to Hamath the Great. Then go down to Gath of the Philistines. Are they better than these kingdoms? Or is their territory greater than yours? Do you put off the day of calamity, and would you bring near the seat of violence? Okay? So let's go through those and see what's being talked about. When he says woe, he's using again the Hebrew word hoi, which is a funeral statement of death, the announcement of death. Wailing and grief is implied. This time it is aimed actually at both Israel, and he mentions Judea, although the focus, of course, here is really on Israel, because their sins are even more excessive. Amos addresses the funeral sound to those who feel completely secure in their position in Israel and in the capital of Samaria. Especially, he's talking to those distinguished, notable, famous persons of wealth in the town. That's who he's addressing this to. He's saying that they have entirely misplaced confidence because they have confused wealth with the blessing of God. Now, have you ever seen any other culture confuse wealth with the blessing of God?
Not here.
Yeah. Makes you wonder. I'm going to quote to you, it just came to mind as I was studying, and I felt like I should quote it. There's a very famous man named Alex de Tocqueville. Have you ever heard of Alex de Tocqueville? He was a French politician, philosopher that came over not long after the War of Independence was over to the United States to kind of go around the colonies and say, what's this place all about? So de Tocqueville wrote extensively about his journeys in America. And he has a couple interesting quotes that I'm going to cite here from some of his writings. He says, first, America is great because she is good. And if she ceases to be good, America will cease to be great.
I've heard that, I just didn't know where.
That's de Tocqueville. Rather prophetic, isn't it?
Is that where Trump got?
I was going to say, is Trump kind of doing that too?
Maybe. It could be where he got Make America Great. It could be. He also made this observation, de Tocqueville said, quote, liberty cannot be established without morality, nor morality without faith.
That's right.
Now, you cannot have a culture that's going to function right without a moral base, and that requires faith. And if you take away the moral base, you no longer have a stable culture. And we're seeing that happen today in the newspapers and everything.
Can you
Yes.
explain the first one to me? America is great.
In other words, he's saying that what he saw about America being a great nation is because he saw moral goodness in the people. He saw a religious people. Another quote he made is he said, the power of America is found in our churches. De Tocqueville said that too, as he went around and went to church services.
Does he believe, or did he believe in the right of freedom of religion?
Yes.
So, if you go back to that point in time, now compare it to the Washington Post or New York Times or everything that's being publicized, whether it's on the internet or any place, freedom of religion good or bad?
Yeah.
You're annoying the question here, Doc.
No. De Tocqueville very clearly said that the foundation of American society he saw was based on religion. He made that extremely clear. America is strong because of its churches. And he would go on and say, he said, when I hear the preachers preaching in America, I understand why America was good. That's another quote, right? It's a near quote by de Tocqueville. So very interesting observations 200 years ago, over 200 years ago. So another point here in these first three verses. God suggests that these eloquent, wealthy, sophisticated men of Samaria challenge their misplaced confidence by visiting a few cities of antiquity and seeing how they've done, seeing what they're like. Now he picks a very interesting one to begin with. I find it fascinating. Of all the cities you could pick, he picks this one. The first one he picks is Calneh. It was one of the four cities established by Nimrod in Genesis 10, verse 10. That's what he picks to say, let me compare you to these cities. It also should be noted in the context of what Amos is saying, that is the upcoming destruction of Israel by the Assyrians, that Nimrod, the Old Testament figure most associated with the worship of astrology, built, of course, the first astrological tower called the Tower of Babel. And he also was the originator of the city of Nineveh, which is the capital of Assyria. So Calneh, in its own right, per archaeological evidence, was indeed a great city with impressive gates and temples. But from its very roots, it was absolutely satanic. That's why he's saying, hey, Samaria, look at Calneh. If you want to look in a mirror and see a reflection, that's the place to go. Isn't it interesting? It goes back to Nimrod. And
everything goes back to that.
It does. That's because he was the first developer of idolatry. Now, further, if you'll turn to Micah 5:6, so turn past Amos, past Jonah to Micah, chapter 5 and verse 6. Let's read 5 and 6 of Micah 5. He says, and this one will be our peace. He's talking about Messiah here. Okay? When the Assyrian invades our land, when he tramples on our citadels, then we will raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 leaders of men. And they will shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword, quote, the land of Nimrod at its entrances, and he will deliver us from the Assyrian when he attacks our land and when he tramples our territory. In other words, he's talking about the millennial time. Remember, the nations are still the nations, even though Christ is ruling on the earth. But remember, at the end of the 1,000 years, a rebellion occurs. And guess who's going to spur this rebellion? Satan in the spirit of Nimrod. And his opponents, the opponents of God, he lumps them together and he's calling them the Assyrians at that point. All right? And he says of it that the land of Nimrod in its entrances. Now, I think that's interesting because he built these cities. He built the Tower of Babel, and I think most biblical scholars would agree with the statement that the Tower of Babel was not only an astrological site, okay, but it also probably was a stargate, a dimensional gate for the spiritual entities. This is why, pardon?
Are you saying they designed that?
Or they used that to come down.
Correct.
Isn't that what you said?
The word Babylon means the gate of the gods, literally. That's the meaning of the word. Oh yeah, I've talked about it before.
Yeah.
But right here we're seeing it again incorporated in this text. Now, further, turn to Isaiah 14, turn back from Micah to Isaiah 14, and I think there's another connection here that's quite interesting. Now this is a very interesting chapter, which we won't go through. I've read it before. This is where, starting in verse 9, it records the fall or the sin of Lucifer. Why and how he rebelled against God and became the person we call Satan. But at the end of it, well, I want you to read verses 21 through 23 of Isaiah 14. Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter. He's talking about the followers of Satan, the fallen angels that came with him, okay, the demons. Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter because of the iniquity of their fathers. They must not rise and take possession of the earth. Notice the next phrase. And fill the face of the world with cities. Satan has used cities to promote his agenda.
Like Las Vegas.
In many cases, in many ways. But think about it. What's the final great city that we see in the 17th and 18th chapter of Revelation? At the very end of the age, there's going to be a great city that arises.
Babylon.
Babylon. Okay? And it's again completely annihilated by God right before his return to the earth.
That's right.
Right. So,
Is it going to be where it was originally?
it is.
It'll pull right up out of the sea or out of the dirt?
Matter of fact, it has been, Saddam Hussein spent much money on excavations and started buildings. There are buildings there in ancient Babylon. They haven't been, to my knowledge, been continued much in recent years, but he did a lot of work on Babylon. He spent a lot of time, a lot of oil money on it. And then he goes on and says, verse 22, and I will rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts, them, these fallen entities, okay? He will cut off from Babylon name and survivors, offspring and posterity, declares the Lord. I will also make it a possession of the hedgehog, which is a terrible translation in English. It's the name of a specific demon in Hebrew, okay? And swamps of water, which literally means places of where demons haunt or live, okay? And I will sweep it with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord of hosts. So he's saying the spiritual entities at the very end, the Lord of hosts will judge and destroy. So it's an interesting, analogy to him saying, look at these cities, Amos says, because they're filled with evil, and they're pagan cities like Babylon and Calneh. All right? Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Pam, make sense? Not make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Questions?
No.
Okay.
Come on, Pam, ask some questions like I do.
Mhm.
No?
Oh. All right. Under D, Amos then directs these esteemed nobles of Samaria to notice Hamath. Now, Hamath is a city northwest of Damascus, of Syria. It's in the mountain range area between Lebanon and Syria on the western side. It's actually, if I remember correctly, it also is, it's on the Orontes River, and it became a traditional northern border of Israel because of the expanded military success of King Jeroboam II. He went up north into what now is Syria, and through military expeditions, conquered those areas. He also went into the northeast too and conquered those areas. So Hamath was considered during this time the northern border of Israel. What he's saying is, look at it because it's going to be easily overrun in the invasion by Assyria. It won't have a chance. Similarly, Amos directs their attention to one of the great fortified cities of Philistia, Gath, which again, archaeologically had monstrous gates, monstrous walls of enormous stonework. It was, interestingly, one of the last bastions of the Anakim, right?
Goliath of Gath.
Goliath of Gath and his buddies
Mm-hmm.
that lived there. And of course we see this, you don't have to turn here, but we went through this actually when we studied Joshua. It's found in Joshua 11:22. Despite the walls and the gates of massive stones, they will not also withstand the Assyrian invasion. So Amos asked Israel thus, do you think you're better prepared than these? Don't kid yourself. You're going, they're going. Okay? Now he also makes a very interesting allusion here, I think, which was kind of fun for me to dig through and figure out. He talks about the seat of violence or the day of calamity. So I looked at the Hebrew and I thought, what does he mean here? Well, it's interesting. He's not really referring so much to when the Assyrians invade, but rather he's talking about the era of the time just before their invasion. And what we find here, and if you want me to be more specific, I'll summarize it, but from the death of Jeroboam II, okay, there were 6 different kings that ruled Israel, half of which gained their kingship through assassinations. So 50% of them assassinated someone else to become king. The city of Samaria, as a result, during that 31 years after Jeroboam, was filled with attempted coups, political revenge, violence, constant regime change, grabs for power by political elements, and political corruption. This is what they lived in for the previous 31 years before the Assyrian invasion. Does this sound like any other cultures just prior to massive upheaval? A lot of them.
Yeah.
Doesn't this sound a bit like what happened in 1990, dear, in Russia? You had all...
1970?
No. In the 90s, the system collapsed. What happens? Chaos, mafia,
Yeah.
political figures, assassinations, death, murders. She lived through it. It was a time of great upheaval until they kind of stabilized the government somewhat there. So he's saying, you've been living in this time. Can't you read the times? Can't you figure out through this 31 years that something is not right? But of course, they couldn't see it. They couldn't see, as I put here, the wheels were falling off because they were so preoccupied and so blinded.
They felt safe.
They felt safe and they were deluded. I don't know if you want me to, but I can tell you exactly which kings were deposed and who did it. I don't know if you want me to go into that information. Well, I'll tell you this. It's found in, okay, where did I put it? It's found in 2 Kings 15:8 through 2 Kings 17:6. You don't have to, I can summarize it for you if you want me to, if you want to know what happened. It starts in 2 Kings 15:8, and the history of this goes through 2 Kings 17, verse 6. So Jeroboam II, the original king, reigned from 794 to 753, and he died. Zechariah, his son, became king, and after 6 months, a man named Shallum, a person in the court, assassinated him and became king. Shallum managed to reign as king 30 days.
Yeah.
30 days. Until a man named Menahem assassinated him and became king. Menahem was extremely evil. He reigned for 10 years. He paid off Tiglath-Pileser, I believe, the third, I'm sorry. So that Tiglath-Pileser, the Assyrian general, wouldn't come into Israel. He extracted 1,000 talents of silver from 60,000 wealthy men, forcing them either to give over the silver or to be killed. That's how he maintained his reign for 10 years.
Sounds like everything that happens in the East.
Of course.
I mean, the Muslims, you got to be kidding me.
Well, look how many presidents who have been assassinated.
Yes.
You know?
Then a man named Pekaniah, who was the son of Menahem, became king and reigned all of 2 years and he was then assassinated in 740 BC by a man named Pekah, who becomes king and reigns 20 years until 732 BC and continues in excessive evil. Then Tiglath-Pileser III comes back to Israel, captures the land in the tribal area of Naphtali and its towns, and they are exiled to Assyria. Hoshea assassinates Pekah in 732, and Hoshea reigns 10 years until 722, and of course was again particularly evil, and he then of course was taken captive by when the Assyrians come in under Shalmaneser of Assyria and invade and destroy Israel in 722 BC. That was what happened in the 31 years prior. So again, you would think they would get a clue something's not right, but of course they did not because they were blinded.
Well, just think what's happening in America today. I mean, the people are ignorant
Yes,
of what's happening.
they are.
They really are.
They're ignorant of the Constitution. They're ignorant of government. They're ignorant of. Do you realize that? I think it was that something like 40% of people polled couldn't tell you the three parts of government. And what kind of country are you going to have when they can't tell you the most basic concept of how your own system of government works? They couldn't name how many justices are on the Supreme Court.
Let alone who they are.
Who they are. They couldn't name how many representatives are together between Congress and the Senate. They couldn't name any of those things. Okay? And again, now we're supposed to have, a common government. How? How when you're that ignorant? Most people have no idea what's in the First Amendment of the Constitution. They have a vague idea what's in the Second Amendment. They're almost completely ignorant of the Fourth Amendment, and they have no concept of the Sixth or Tenth. They couldn't even tell you barely what any of those were about.
And where were they written at?
And where were they written?
Right.
That's a
Well,
real myth.
when the news media interviews the man in the street, they ask very simple questions. Like, what's our national anthem? I don't know.
Right.
And it's very, very simple things. And they don't know.
It's abysmal ignorance, and it's very similar to what we were just talking about here with the Samaritans.
It's interesting, one of the early writers, I believe it was Franklin, that said, when our country loses its way as far as when we don't have Christian people at the helm of our government, it will soon be lost.
It's true.
And I think we're seeing that.
Yeah, Franklin also said, I think we've made a republic, gentlemen. Let's see if anyone can hold it.
Yes.
That was another quote by Franklin. Okay, verses 4 through 7 of Amos 6, moving brilliantly and rapidly along.
You hear that brilliant person.
Of course.
We heard it.
Well, we're such a smart group,
Oh, well, yeah, right.
4 through 7. Those who recline on beds of ivory and sprawl on their couches and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall, who improvise to the sound of the harp, and like David have composed songs for themselves, who drink wine from sacrificial bowls, while they anoint themselves with the finest of oils. Yet have they not grieved over the ruin of Joseph. Therefore they will now go into exile at the head of the exiles, and the sprawlers' banqueting will pass away. All right, let's go through this. They were, bottom line, they were blinded by luxurious indolence. Luxurious indolence. They slept in beds of inlaid ivory and, quote, sprawled on the couches. The word sprawled in Hebrew is the word sarah, and it means the intoxicated stupor of alcohol, literally so drunk you can't stand up. You're sprawled.
That's right.
That's right. It's Friday night. It says they ate only the best gourmet meat, and they made up and sang songs while intoxicated, imagining themselves to be musicians like King David. Yeah. Not content to drink wine from goblets, they went and took the priest's sacred bowls that were done for libations and sacrifices in the temple and used them to intoxicate themselves more thoroughly. They put the most expensive lotions on their skin. Because of such selfish indulgence, God says that when Assyria invades, they will be the first ones to go. They'll be in the head of the line that will have the hooks in their noses and their ears to be taken out over into the Syrian territory.
When you're well and prosper, it's kind of hard to imagine.
Yes, it is hard to imagine.
I
So,
think I just got lost. Repeat what you just said.
he's talking about all of these high-class, arrogant, wealthy nobles of Samaria, the capital of the north. He's talking about what they do, what they eat, how they act,
Where they live.
their drunkenness, how they live,
Lifestyle.
their lifestyle. And then he says, when the Assyrians invade, you will be in the head of the line that will leave.
So he's talking literally of, as we see it today, Syria itself.
Assyria.
Assyria, not Syria.
No, Assyria.
Map-wise,
It's north of present-day Syria. It's,
north of present-day Syria.
yes, it's in, Assyria is an empire just north with its capital Nineveh. I probably should have put a map up, but. Okay, now let's read verses 8 through 11. We continue. The Lord God has sworn by himself. The Lord God of hosts has declared, I loathe the arrogance of Jacob. I detest his citadels. Therefore I will deliver up the city and all it contains. And it will be, if 10 men are left in one house, they will die. Then one's uncle or his undertaker will lift him up to carry out his bones from the house. And he will say to the one who is in the innermost part of the house, in other words, the 11th that didn't die, okay, is anyone else with you? And that one will say, no one. Then he will say to him, be quiet, for the name of the Lord is not to be mentioned. For behold, the Lord is going to command that the great houses be smashed to pieces and the small houses to fragments. Now, he's saying God detests their arrogance. He has no regard for their man-made walls and fortifications. And in the upcoming Assyrian invasion, he will deliver everything they own over to the Assyrians. Everything they possess and are so proud of, all their wealth, all of their money, all of their beautiful furniture will be taken away. He again states the death rate will be greater than 90%. And then he talks in verse 10, he says that if 10 men die in a house and a relative as an uncle or an undertaker comes to, quote, get the remains, and if he finds a man who has survived in the house, that undertaker or uncle will insist the survivor be silent. In other words, the uncle doesn't want God's name to be spoken out loud for fear that even worse devastation will occur. They begin to realize this is organized by God. So don't even speak his name.
So like if God doesn't notice, you just don't say anything?
Exactly.
Continue to hide?
Huddle in the corner and hope that you live. That's what he's literally telling them. Now, of course, he says everything will be smashed to rubble, so the big expensive homes will do no better than the little houses. It will all be trampled underfoot. Now, it's interesting here about the Hebrew word for undertaker. It means one who burns the bodies. It's a very interesting term because in Judaism, cremation was very uncommon. The standard was burial. Therefore, it seems to imply that there's so many dead laying around, and the risk of disease is so great that they've resorted to mass cremation to try to control it, which is what you do in any disaster. You don't try to bury people in a mass disaster. You try to get rid of the bodies as quickly as you can by making the biggest fire you can, or setting houses that are left on fire and burning the bodies in them. Because if you leave them around, the disease will become impossible around you.
It's not that easy to burn human bodies.
No, and it takes a lot of wood to do it.
Yeah.
It takes a cord of wood to disintegrate one body to ash. A cord of wood.
That's a lot.
8 feet by 4 feet by 4.
90% is water.
Yeah.
That's why.
What is your take on cremation versus burial today?
That's a really good question. It's a good question, and I can't tell you that I know the answer to it. Paul, one point in, it's 1 Corinthians 13, he says, even if you offer your body to be burnt, yada, 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 he alludes to cremation. All I can tell you is that the tradition of Judaism was burial. But I cannot give you any verse in Old or New Testament that says that cremation is wrong or burial is the only proper alternative. I can't give you one. Some people have alluded, because of this verse and Paul's verse in Corinthians, that maybe burial is the proper way.
Paul could apply to Gentile culture.
Yes, it's true.
And then when we read the Old Testament, all the way how they, they buried their ancestors.
They did. And that was definitely the tradition. So I don't think my personal opinion is, and I've kind of struggled with it myself, I don't think that there's any clear statement either way. I think it's left to personal preference and what a person believes they should do.
Did you ask what is right, what is wrong?
I asked him what his take on it was, because I've talked to many people who I consider Christians, and they've been cremated, or that was on their, and they were then when they died. And I talked to others who said, no way, because, God made me who I am, therefore I would be destroying this body. So, I'm kind of torn.
Generally speaking, having been in this business for 40 years,
You're an undertaker?
I've insured them.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
right, that's right, you were.
And he's been to lots of funerals and a lot of people.
I've been regrettably to
Sorry.
many of them.
Yeah, I made that mistake.
But that question comes up when there's a fire or when there's an accident and
I
a
know.
child burns up in a car. You don't know what to tell. No different than you don't know what to say in answer to a question. The thing that I have a problem with is the thing that dictates more than anything else if it isn't an accident is money.
Right.
True.
Is what?
Money.
It's money. If you look at newcomer, he's talking $1,400 for using their facilities and cremating the body.
Right.
If you go to Sheddinger, they're looking at $3,000 to cremate and use their facilities.
And if you're looking for an average burial cost with a coffin, you're probably talking about better $10,000.
Right.
So 10 grand is not an unusual number,
Yeah.
including a stone and including a cemetery plot. Now, if you go to a retail facilities on a cemetery, Sunset Cemetery on West Broad Street, huge cemetery, you're talking $6,000 to $25,000 for a grave plot.
Wow.
Ooh.
Yeah, and so if you go to a place like a township,
Right. Like up the road, down the
Is
road.
it okay to bury someone on your property?
No.
It's not, that's illegal.
No.
well, it isn't illegal. No, depending on the amount of acreage you have.
Oh, really?
Well, okay, but the average bear doesn't
What's
have
the,
that.
what's
But it
the,
is okay if you have,
Yeah, it's over 10 acres.
okay.
oh, good, honey.
Good. Oh,
Down there by the creek.
You know what, I could dig the whole design.
that's right. We've just answered Ann's question, haven't we?
All right, thank you.
That's very interesting.
So, Norm, if it's more more than 6 acres, then
10 acres.
It's
10 acres.
10 acres, then,
or more.
then you can bury someone on the property. If
Yeah.
it's less than
So if I don't show up, that's legal.
Yeah, thank you.
Listen, Mikey, shooting range.
You can't shoot.
That's right. That's right. That's right. Very good.
We slap
Okay.
Oh, dear.
Now, I want to point out something to you because of my normally creepy mind. Because I was thinking about the absolute incredible death rate that God predicts in Samaria, right? It's devastating. It's 90% dead.
Right, that's almost all.
Now, there is a very interesting site on the internet that started 4 years ago. And I captured part of the site for you, and I'm going to hand it around to you. It's an interesting site called Deagle.com. Has anyone ever seen Deagle.com?
No.
Well, there are a variety of theories about who puts out Deagle.com. Some people say that it's a combination of the NSA and the CIA. There are multiple groups that apparently are behind Deagle.com. But what Deagle.com is, and I'll pass it, it's a list of all major countries in the world, okay? It predicts, as of 2025, what their population, it tells you what their population is, what their population will be in 2025, what their gross domestic product is, what it will be in 2025, what their military expenditures are in dollars and what they'll be in 2025, and the purchasing power parity, okay, what it is now in that country and what it'll be in 2025. It's a prediction concept, model. So somebody is taking data, they're throwing immigration information, they're throwing disease potential information, they're throwing all this thing into some computer program, and they're predicting country by country in 183 countries here what the population will be. Now, let me read you four.
They've been doing this long before that came about.
That is true, but Deagle is probably one of the more well-known engines of this, okay? And you can read at the bottom. It's rather interesting to read at the bottom about Deagle and what they say. Here's the United States. As of 2017, the estimated population of the United States is 326,620,000 people.
How many?
326,620,000 people. That's the estimated population as of 2017 last year.
That includes me, that means.
Yes. Deagle predicts that in 2025, now listen to this, the estimated population of the United States will be 99,553,100 people.
That's quite a drop.
That is a 60% decrease in population.
And that is why?
Well, you can read at the bottom what Deagle says. The average, the gross domestic product of the United States is $19,360,000,000. Deagle predicts in 2025 that it will be $2,445,124. The military expenditure last year of the United States was $637 million. Deagle predicts that in 2025 it'll be 32 million. Yeah, 32 million.
That number's dead wrong on what they spent last year.
637 million?
That's dead wrong.
I mean 637 billion. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry. 630. It's put in weird. It's put in millions of U.S. dollars. Okay, so I'm trying to.
But the amount of money that the only reason I'm saying is the amount of money that Trump spent and signed off on to wipe out ISIS compared to what Obama had in the military and what he has allocated for parts, just parts, for equipment like Mikey would run, okay, is up in the billions.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry.
The number is, that's why
It's 637 billion.
That's what the military spent in this year.
637 billion, yeah.
Okay, and what's it going to be in 2025?
They estimated as being 32 billion.
They've already allocated clear up past that and what their needs are going to be in the Office of Budget and in the military.
Yeah. Now here's the interesting point though.
I'm wondering where in the world they got those numbers.
Well, that's the interesting thing about Deagle. And I'll let you look at this and you're welcome to make copies of it. The interesting thing is, it talks about a massive depopulation in the United States, but other countries it doesn't. For instance, in China, it estimates,
Put that out.
its estimated population last year was 1,380,000,000,000. Is that right? 1,380,000,000 people. Okay? Deagle estimates in 2025 there will be almost exactly that amount. It will be 1,358,000,000 people.
That's in China?
Yes. India, almost identical. Actually, India, they estimate is going to get a couple 100 million more. Russia, there you want to know this. They estimate its population out 142,260,000. About 142 million people.
This is now?
Yes.
Okay.
They estimate that in 2025 it'll be 141. Almost identically the same.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
They go to Indonesia, Mexico. You'll notice that in many of these countries they're estimating no change or population growth. But in the United States,
It's a decrease.
they're estimating a massive decrease. Now, for whatever it is, and whatever you think about Deagle, okay, it's an interesting site.
Well, there's just many old people who will die by that.
Part of it's that. Part of it's they're saying there's going to be mass emigration from the United States. At the bottom, the second page, they're talking about disease rates. They're talking about they talk about why they.
Suggestion.
Pardon?
Suggestion.
You want mine?
No.
No. Yes, Norman. Give us your suggestion.
Right.
Did you realize there's 2 internets?
Yes,
What's the second one?
it's the military one, I believe.
That's correct. Can you access it?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. You know that the military currently possesses the opportunity to put on sites on the internet to get people to read them.
Yes,
You know why?
because they love disinformation,
What else?
propaganda,
What else?
well, all kinds of stuff. Go on.
Well, you guys tell us.
Well, if you look at what they're trying to encapsulate, what's one thing that we have a problem with? Sex trafficking.
Yeah.
Okay. We know that that's a monumental worldwide major issue.
Yes.
Okay. The military is involved with that. Do you read it? Is it in the Washington Post? Is it in the New York Times?
No, but there's a whole lot of things that are not ever reported in the major newspapers because they don't want to deal with them.
You mean participating in it, not preventing it. You
I'm
mean
sorry.
military involvement, participation versus.
They're involved with the internet on the side that Tim's pulling that off.
Yeah.
Okay. And they establish exactly what she just said. They establish things to entrap people, to see who, how, why. And if you look just in Columbus, for example, the number of school teachers that have been entrapped in sex trafficking or being pedophiles or other things, they lowered the boom on them. You know how they did it? They planted those type of web pages on the internet. And what I would encourage you to do, if you don't want to be watched, don't be on that kind of a web page.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, I only throw out Deagle.com because I think it's interesting to consider when you're talking about, the future of a country. It's just, for your information, look at it. I can make copies if you want. Now let's finish. We got verses 12 to 14 to cover. Ready?
Yes.
All right. So, Amos says, do horses run on rocks, or does one plow them with oxen? Yet you have turned justice into poison, and the fruit of righteousness into wormwood. you who rejoice in Lodabar and say, have we not by our own strength taken Karnaim for ourselves? For behold, I am going to raise up a nation against you, O house of Israel, declares the Lord God of hosts. And they will afflict you from the entrance of Hamath, remember the northern border, to the brook of Arabah, which means the desert southeast of the Dead Sea. From north to south, they're going to invade. So, he illustrates again in agricultural terms the absolute delusion Israel was under spiritually. He proposes two inane examples of nature to illustrate this. Can horses successfully with their hooves run on rocky surfaces? Or can one plow a stone cliff?
No.
That's what he's saying. And he's saying that their spiritual delusion is so dangerous and their moral distortion is so bad that they no longer have a bit of common sense. That's what he's trying to say. You have no common sense left whatsoever. And it has become like a poison, like wormwood, that traditional famous poison, that will surely kill them. Then Amos does a very interesting thing in verse 13. He intentionally misspells the name of a town. The actual name of the town, you see, he calls it Lo-Debar in the end of verse 13. Well, that's not really what the name of the town is, okay? Actually, well, the actual town is not Lo-Debar, but Lo-Dabar. And it was a town that is east of the Jordan that Jeroboam II, during his military expansion, conquered. We see references to it in 2 Samuel 9 and also 2 Samuel 17. You don't necessarily have to turn there, but you'll see this town mentioned. So he intentionally changes the name or the spelling, and the spelling he changes it to means nothing.
Actually, in Russian, it is nothing.
Yeah, good. I'm glad they accurately portrayed that. So he said, you're proud of all these towns that were captured and have been now included in Israel. He says, but it ain't going to amount to nothing. Then he mentions another town, Karnaim, which in Hebrew means horns or the strength of a bull, indicating what's going to happen to them when the Syrians invade. They're going to be gored like being gored by a bull, by that type of strength. Now in verse 14, he says that he will afflict, see, the second part he says, then they will afflict you from the entrance of Hamath. The word afflict in Hebrew there is the word lakatz, and it means to oppress in a way to flatten or crush. So their arrogance that's blinded them from seeing what is coming will result in them being literally smashed to pieces and trampled underfoot by Assyria. Eventually, he says, they will learn a bitter lesson of what power actually caused their demise. Quote, the Lord of hosts. Host means the angelic army. So in summary, I want you to turn to Deuteronomy 6, to one of the most famous passages that the Jews memorized when they were little kids. Okay? And I want you to close by us reading this section, because it's what they forgot. Starting in verse 6, Deuteronomy 6. It's called the Shema, famous passage of the Jews. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. And you shall teach them diligently to your sons, and you shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. In other words, a lot of Bible study. Okay? And you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be frontals on your foreheads. In other words, they should be before you and by your head all the time. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Then it shall come about, when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you, great and splendid cities which you did not build. In other words, when they came in under Joshua's conquest, as we know, they conquered these cities, inherited, and took over, right? And houses full of good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you shall eat and be satisfied. It's part of the blessing that God gave them in the conquest. Verse 12, then watch yourself, lest you forget the Lord who brought you from the land of Egypt out of a house of slavery. You shall fear only the Lord your God, and you shall worship him and swear by his name. And you shall not follow other gods, any of the gods of the people who surround you. What did we just learn they were doing in Samaria? Studying astrology and demons and fallen angels, etc. He says, for the Lord your God in the midst of you is a jealous God. Otherwise the anger of the Lord God, your God, will be kindled against you, and he will wipe you off the face of the earth.
Yeah.
That's back in the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy.
When they took the bride, he says, swear by his name.
Yes. Think about it. This is supposed to be the most memorized section of all the Torah for the Jews. Every little kid is supposed to be taught this and should be able to recite it. Even today in Hebrew school.
Yeah, it's not done.
Well, it's not done like it should be. But the point is, it's been a tradition of Judaism for thousands of years. Okay? This is exactly what the Samaritans didn't do.
Well, when you're talking about this, when you're talking about the Jewish kids, you made a very strong point. Are the Jewish people practicing Judaism?
No.
Okay, that's why I made a comment about the kids.
Right.
They're not getting taught because the parents aren't.
That is true.
Which is happening in our
Right.
Christianity.
That is true. It is the enigma and dilemma of trying to communicate your faith to the next generation. It's a pretty tough act. It's very difficult to do. Oh, yes. Now, I wanted to do something we can, okay? We'll go ahead and end this for tonight. But I want to